The year was 1944. The month was June. The date was the 6th. And for 156,000 young men sailing across a storm-tossed English Channel, it would be a day that would either end in victory or annihilation. Among them were soldiers bound for a 5-mile stretch of French coastline that would forever be known by a single, haunting name: Omaha Beach. This is the story of what really happened on the bloodiest shore of D-Day. And before this day ends, you will understand why historians call it the longest dawn in human history. What you're about to witness isn't just another World War II documentary. This is the untold truth about ordinary men thrust into extraordinary hell. Farm boys who'd never seen combat, factory workers who'd barely fired a rifle, students who'd traded textbooks for bayonets. In the next 12 minutes, you'll walk beside them through the darkness before dawn. You'll feel the terror as their landing craft approached a beach transformed into a killing zone. And you'll discover why, against all odds, their sacrifice changed the course of human history. Hit that subscribe button now, because this 10-part series will take you deeper into D-Day than you've ever been before. The night of June 5th, 1944, was unlike any other night in the history of warfare. Across southern England, from Plymouth to Portsmouth, from Southampton to Dover, the greatest invasion armada ever assembled prepared to sail. 7,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and crowded into those vessels, shoulder to shoulder, were young men who knew that tomorrow, everything would change. The tension was suffocating. Some men wrote final letters home, their handwriting shaking with every word. Others prayed silently, clutching rosaries or dog-eared photos of sweethearts they might never see again. A few tried to sleep, knowing it was impossible, while others vomited from fear disguised as seasickness. For months, they'd trained for this moment. For months, they'd been told that Hitler's Atlantic Wall was formidable, but not impregnable, that the air bombardment would soften the defenses, that the naval guns would destroy the bunkers, that once they hit the beach, they'd be inland within hours. But in the pits of their stomachs, every single man suspected what the brass wouldn't say out loud, that many of them wouldn't survive the first 5 minutes. That Omaha Beach, stretching 5 miles along the Normandy coast between the villages of Vierville and Colville, was going to be a slaughterhouse. Intelligence reports had been wrong before. Maps had been inaccurate. Weather forecasts had failed. And as the fleet crossed the channel in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, nature itself seemed to conspire against them. The waves grew monstrous, 10 to 12 feet high, smashing against the hulls of landing craft that were never designed for such violence. Men hung over the sides, retching until there was nothing left inside them. Equipment tore loose and crashed across decks. Landing craft began taking on water. Some capsized entirely, sending men weighted down with 60 pounds of gear plunging into the black depths where no one could save them. Aboard the USS Samuel Chase, Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider of the 5th Ranger Battalion looked out at the horizon. Somewhere beyond that darkness was the coast of France. Somewhere beyond that darkness were German machine guns, mortars, artillery pieces, all waiting in reinforced concrete bunkers built into the cliffs. And somewhere beyond that darkness was the answer to the question every soldier was asking himself. Would I be brave enough? When the ramp dropped and the bullets started flying, would my legs carry me forward, or would I freeze? Would I see tomorrow's sunset, or would this dawn be my last? The crossing took longer than planned. The storm had scattered formations, delayed schedules, and turned a precisely choreographed invasion into something closer to controlled chaos. Radio communications crackled with static and confusion. Naval officers recalculated approach vectors while trying to keep convoys together. Bomber pilots struggled to find their targets through cloud cover that wasn't supposed to be there. And in the landing craft, the men could do nothing but wait, counting down the minutes and the miles to a beach they couldn't yet see, but could already imagine in terrible detail. At approximately 300 hours, 3 o'clock in the morning, the transports reached their positions roughly 12 miles off the French coast. This was the moment. The point of no return. Loudspeakers crackled to life. Orders were shouted over the roar of wind and waves, and slowly, methodically, the loading process began. Men climbed down cargo nets hanging against the sides of ships, their hands numb from cold and fear, their boots slipping on wet ropes as the sea churned below them. One wrong step meant a fall that could break bones or send a soldier plummeting between the landing craft and the transport, where he'd be crushed like an insect. Several men fell. Some were pulled from the water. Others simply vanished. The landing craft circled in the darkness, forming waves of assault that would hit the beach in a carefully timed sequence. The first wave, scheduled for 0630 hours, 6:30 in the morning, would consist of 36 landing craft, carrying approximately 1,450 men. Their mission was to secure the beach exits, knock out the fortified positions, and create a safe corridor for the thousands of troops who would follow. In theory, it sounded achievable. In practice, it would become one of the greatest military disasters of the entire war. As the darkness began to fade and the eastern sky turned from black to deep blue to pale gray, the men caught their first glimpses of the French coastline. Low cliffs rising perhaps 150 feet above the beach. Grassy bluffs riddled with what looked like dark openings. Those openings were German positions, machine gun nests, mortar pits, artillery bunkers. And behind those positions, waiting in trenches and foxholes and reinforced strong points, were the men of the German 352nd Infantry Division, veterans of the Eastern Front. Battle-hardened soldiers who'd been told that if the Allies landed here, they had to stop them on the beach or lose the war. The bombardment was supposed to change everything. Starting at 0550 hours, 329 American B-24 Liberator bombers were to carpet bomb the beach defenses, turning Omaha into a cratered wasteland where no German soldier could survive. But the cloud cover was too thick. Visibility was near zero, and fearing they might hit their own troops approaching the shore, the bomber crews delayed their drops by seconds. Just seconds. But those seconds meant the bombs fell inland, behind the German positions, exploding harmlessly in empty fields while the bunkers and machine gun nests remained completely intact. Then came the naval bombardment. Battleships and cruisers opened fire, their massive guns hurling shells toward the shore in a thunderous barrage that the men in the landing craft could feel in their chests. Surely nothing could survive that, they thought. Surely the Germans would be dead or stunned or fleeing when we land. But the naval guns were firing from too far out, their shells also falling inland or skipping off the surface of the bunker's thick concrete walls. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress Europe, stood untouched. The trap was still set. The killing ground was still perfect. And at 0630 hours, right on schedule, the first wave of landing. Craft began their final approach to Omaha Beach. The roar of engines mixed with the crash of surf and the whistle of incoming German artillery, shells that were already finding their range. Men gripped their rifles tighter. Some closed their eyes. Others stared straight ahead. And every single one of them knew deep in their souls that in less than 60 seconds, hell was going to open up in front of them. This was the longest dawn, and for hundreds of men, it would be the last dawn they'd ever see. In the next episode of this series, we'll take you inside Hitler's Atlantic Wall. You'll see how German engineers transformed every inch of Normandy's coastline into a death trap. You'll learn about the concrete bunkers, the steel obstacles, the hidden mines, and the interlocking fields of fire designed to annihilate anyone who dared approach. Because to understand what happened on Omaha Beach, you first have to understand the fortress the Allies were sailing toward. A fortress built specifically to do one thing: kill, hit that subscribe button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss episode 2. Share this video with anyone who needs to know the true story of D-Day. And remember, we're just getting started. The storm is coming, and Omaha Beach is waiting before D-Day. Before Omaha Beach became synonymous with sacrifice, before the first American boot touched French sand, there was Hitler's obsession. An obsession that would consume millions of tons of concrete, enslave thousands of workers, and transform the entire coastline of Europe into the most formidable fortress the modern world had ever seen. They called it the Atlantic Wall. And what the Allies were about to discover was that every single inch of it was designed for one purpose only: to turn invasion into suicide. You think you know D-Day? You've seen the movies. You've read the books. But unless you understand what the Germans built on those beaches, you can't possibly comprehend the courage it took to attack them. In this episode, we're taking you inside the Atlantic Wall. We're showing you the bunkers that could withstand direct naval bombardment, the obstacles that ripped landing craft apart like tin cans, the machine gun positions with overlapping fields of fire that left no place to hide, and the brilliant, terrifying defensive strategy that turned a simple beach into a killing zone unlike anything in military history. Stay with us, because before we storm Omaha, we need to see what was waiting there. And trust me, it's worse than you imagined. The story of the Atlantic Wall begins with paranoia and ends with blood. In 1942, Adolf Hitler stood at the absolute height of his power. German armies had conquered France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway. The swastika flew from the Arctic Circle to North Africa, but Hitler knew something his generals tried to ignore. That eventually, inevitably, the Allies would attempt an invasion across the English Channel. And when they did, Germany's only chance of survival was to stop them on the beaches, not push them back after they landed, not fight them in the hedgerows of Normandy, stop them cold in the surf, in the first hour with such devastating violence that they'd never dare try again. So Hitler gave an order. Build a wall, not a wall of brick or stone, but a wall of steel and concrete that would stretch 1,500 miles from the border of Spain all the way to Norway. A wall studded with thousands of bunkers, strong points, artillery positions, and anti-tank obstacles. A wall manned by the Wehrmacht, the German army, and designed by the brilliant military architect, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself. And Rommel, who'd studied Allied tactics in North Africa, knew exactly how to turn a beach into a graveyard. The Atlantic Wall wasn't just one defensive line. It was layers upon layers of interlocking death traps. The first obstacle an invasion force would encounter was several miles offshore. Underwater barriers, steel beams driven into the seabed at angles, topped with mines that would detonate on contact, blowing the bottoms out of landing craft before they got anywhere near the beach. Hedgehogs came next. Welded steel structures that looked like giant children's jacks, each point sharp enough to tear through the hull of any vessel unlucky enough to strike them. Behind the hedgehogs were Belgian gates, massive steel frames 10 feet tall, also mined, also designed to stop landing craft in deep water where troops would have to jump out and wade hundreds of yards under fire. And if you somehow made it through those obstacles, if your landing craft managed to navigate the steel forest and reach the beach itself, that's when the real nightmare began. The beach was mined everywhere, anti-personnel mines buried just beneath the sand, anti-tank mines positioned to destroy any vehicle that made it ashore, and those famous Czech hedgehogs, more steel obstacles arranged in rows that vehicles couldn't drive over and men couldn't easily move. The beach exits, the natural pathways through the bluffs where roads led inland, were especially heavily defended. Concrete walls, barbed wire, more mines, and covering every inch of every exit were bunkers. The bunkers were engineering marvels and instruments of death. Built from reinforced concrete 6 to 10 feet thick, they were essentially indestructible. Naval shells would bounce off them. Bombs would explode nearby without penetrating. Each bunker housed machine guns, usually the German MG-42, a weapon so fast it could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. American soldiers would later call it Hitler's buzzsaw because of the sound it made. A sound that meant death was cutting through the air at 30 yards per second. And the bunkers were positioned with interlocking fields of fire, meaning if you found cover from one machine gun, another would have a clear shot at you. There was nowhere safe. Nowhere to hide. Rommel added his own special touches. He studied tide tables obsessively. He calculated exactly where landing craft would have to approach based on the time of day and the state of the tide. Then he concentrated his obstacles and mines in those precise zones. He also ordered what became known as Rommel's asparagus, thousands of wooden stakes driven into fields behind the beaches to prevent glider landings. And he demanded more mines, millions of them. By the spring of 1944, the Germans had laid over 6 million mines along the French coast. 6 million hidden killers waiting for a footstep or a wheel or a stroke of terrible luck. At Omaha Beach specifically, the defenses were even more formidable than at other landing zones. The terrain favored the defenders perfectly. The beach itself was about 300 yards wide at low tide, offering almost no cover. Just open sand. Behind the sand was a seawall and a shingle embankment of smooth stones that vehicles couldn't climb. And behind that were the bluffs, rising steeply, covered in grass and scrub, honeycombed with trenches and foxholes. At the top of those bluffs, commanding the entire beach, were the main German positions. Concrete bunkers housing artillery pieces, mortars, and machine guns. From up there, German soldiers had a perfect view of anyone trying to cross the beach below. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. The German forces defending Omaha consisted primarily of the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit that Allied intelligence either missed or underestimated. These weren't second-rate coastal defense troops. These were combat veterans, many transferred from the Russian front, where they'd learned to fight savagely against overwhelming odds. They knew the beach. They'd practiced on it. They'd ranged every sector with their weapons so they could fire accurately even in smoke or darkness. And they'd been told repeatedly that the invasion, when it came, would be the decisive moment of the entire war. That if they held the beaches for even one day, the Allies would falter. That if they killed enough Americans in the first hour, the invasion would fail. That their Führer was counting on them. Rommel inspected Omaha Beach personally in early 1944. He walked the sand at low tide, studying angles and sight lines. He stood in the bunkers and looked out at the water, imagining how it would look filled with landing craft. And he made adjustments. More mines here, another machine gun position there. Clear those bushes so we have better fields of fire. Move that mortar pit 20 meters to the left. Every detail mattered. Every calculation brought the trap closer to perfection. When he left, Rommel was satisfied. He told his staff that if the Allies landed at Omaha, the beach would run red with blood. But the Atlantic Wall, for all its strength, had weaknesses. It required constant manning, constant maintenance, constant supplies of ammunition and reinforcements. And by 1944, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. Resources were stretched thin. Some positions were undermanned. Some units were equipped with captured French or Russian weapons because German factories couldn't produce enough. Rommel kept demanding more concrete, more steel, more mines, more men. But Hitler's attention was divided between the Eastern Front, Italy, and the looming threat in the West. The wall was strong, but it wasn't invincible. And both sides knew that when the invasion finally came, it would be a collision of steel and flesh on a scale the world had never witnessed. And now, the Allies were coming. Across the channel, through the storm, toward Omaha, toward the bunkers and the mines and the machine guns, toward the killing ground Rommel had spent 2 years perfecting. The longest dawn was breaking, and the Atlantic Wall was about to be tested. In the next episode, you'll meet the men who would attack that fortress. The farm boys and factory workers, the students and shop clerks, the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions who'd never seen combat, who'd trained on peaceful English beaches, who'd been told they were the best equipped and best prepared soldiers in history. You'll hear their stories, you'll read their letters, and you'll understand why, even knowing what awaited them, they climbed into those landing craft and headed toward Omaha anyway. Episode 3, The Men Who Would Land, drops next. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and prepare yourself, because the story's about to get personal. His name was Private First Class John Barnes. He was 19 years old. He'd grown up on a farm in Iowa, where the biggest danger he'd faced was a temperamental bull. He'd never been more than 50 miles from home until the army shipped him to England. He wrote letters to his mother every week, telling her he was safe, telling her not to worry, telling her he'd be home before she knew it. On the morning of June 6, 1944, Private Barnes climbed into Landing Craft 815, bound for Omaha Beach. He never saw his 20th birthday, and he was just one of thousands. This isn't a story about nameless soldiers or faceless divisions. This is about real men. Men with families and dreams and fears. Men who'd been civilians just months earlier, thrust into the greatest invasion in history with barely enough training to load a rifle. In this episode, we're introducing you to the human faces of D-Day, the teenage rangers who'd volunteered for the toughest assignment, the 30-year-old sergeants with wives and children back home, the medics who'd sworn to save lives, not take them, You'll hear their words, read their letters, and understand the weight they carried, not just 60 pounds of equipment, but the hopes of millions. Stay with us, because before we watch them storm Omaha, we need to know who they were and what they stood for. The men who would land at Omaha Beach on D-Day came from every corner of America. From the mountains of Appalachia and the plains of Kansas, from the steel mills of Pennsylvania and the fishing docks of Massachusetts, from farms where they'd worked before dawn and cities where they'd never seen a star-filled sky. They were black and white, though the Army kept them largely segregated. They were immigrants' sons and descendants of the Mayflower. They were Catholics clutching rosaries, Protestants carrying pocket Bibles, Jews who knew exactly what they were fighting against. And they were young.
God, they were so young.
The average age was 23. Thousands were 19 or younger. Some had lied about their age to enlist, desperate to join the fight before it ended. The two main units assigned to Omaha were the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, and the 29th Infantry Division, the Blue and Gray. The 1st Division was experienced, veteran soldiers who'd fought in North Africa and Sicily. They'd seen combat. They'd seen death. They carried themselves with a certain grim confidence that came from surviving battles others hadn't. The 29th, by contrast, was green. National Guard troops activated before the war, mostly from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. They'd trained endlessly in England, mock invasions on safe beaches where the only enemy was exhaustion and the drill sergeant's endless shouting. But they'd never faced live fire. Never watched a friend die. Never had to make the split-second choice between cover and courage. Private Robert Sales was typical of the 29th. He'd joined up in 1942, fresh out of high school in Baltimore. He'd wanted to be a pilot but failed the vision test, so infantry it was. In letters home, he wrote about the English countryside, about the pubs where locals bought them drinks, about the girls who smiled at American uniforms. He wrote about being homesick, about missing his mother's cooking, about wondering what his friends from high school were doing. He never wrote about his fear, even though it gnawed at him every day. Fear of failing his buddies. Fear of freezing when the shooting started. Fear of dying in a foreign country and never seeing home again. On June 5th, his final letter home said simply, "Tomorrow's the big day. Don't worry about me, Mom. I'll be fine." Then there were the Rangers. The 5th Ranger Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, was composed entirely of volunteers, men who'd signed up for the most dangerous assignments, who'd trained harder than anyone else, who'd been taught to climb cliffs under fire and destroy fortifications with their bare hands if necessary. They were the elite, the best of the best. And they knew that when the Army sent Rangers, it meant the mission was borderline suicidal. Sergeant Frank Paragori of the 5th Rangers had survived battles in North Africa and Italy. He'd won medals for valor. But even he admitted years later that the night before Omaha, he questioned whether his luck had finally run out. The officers bore a different kind of burden. They'd trained these men, led them, promised them that if they followed orders and kept their heads down, most of them would make it through. But officers also read intelligence reports the enlisted men didn't see. They studied maps and photographs that revealed just how heavily defended Omaha was. They attended briefings where generals spoke bluntly about acceptable casualty rates. Acceptable, as if the death of 1,000 men could be calculated like a cost of doing business. Brigadier General Norman Cota of the 29th Division was 51 years old, ancient by combat standards. He'd been a planner at the highest levels, helping design the invasion itself, and now he'd volunteered to go ashore with the first wave, to lead from the front, because he believed that's what real leaders did. His aide tried to talk him out of it. Cota refused. "If I'm sending boys into hell, I'm going with them." In the weeks leading up to D-Day, the troops were confined to marshalling areas, fenced compounds near the southern coast of England where security was absolute. No phone calls. No letters out. No contact with civilians who might inadvertently leak information. The men knew something massive was coming, but they didn't know when or where. Tension built. Poker games grew more intense, with men betting entire paychecks because what did money matter if you weren't coming back? Some attended church services that were standing room only. Others tried to lose themselves in books, reading the same pages over and over without retaining a word. The night of June 5th, Officers finally told them, tomorrow, Normandy, Omaha Beach. Some men reacted with relief. Finally, after all this waiting, they'd get it over with. Others went pale, suddenly understanding that this was real, that in less than 12 hours they'd be under fire. Chaplains moved through the ranks, offering blessings and hearing confessions. Medics checked supplies obsessively, triple-counting bandages and morphine syrettes. And the men wrote letters, thousands of letters. Some were practical, giving instructions about bank accounts and life insurance. Others were desperate declarations of love to wives and girlfriends and children. A few were apologies to parents they'd disappointed or siblings they'd fought with. And some men wrote nothing because what could you possibly say? Private Harold Baumgarten of the 116th Infantry Regiment wrote to his family, "I am writing this letter the night before the invasion. By the time you read this, you'll know whether I made it or not. I want you to know that I wasn't scared." Well, that's a lie. I'm terrified, but I'm also proud. Proud to serve, proud to fight alongside these men, proud to do my small part to end this war. I love you all. And if I don't make it, please don't cry for too long. I died doing something important. Something that mattered. Baumgarten would survive Omaha Beach, but he'd be wounded 5 times, and he'd carry the memories of that day for the rest of his life. Equipment checks became rituals. Men cleaned rifles that were already spotless, sharpened knives that didn't need sharpening, adjusted straps on packs they'd adjusted 100 times. Anything to keep their hands busy, to stop thinking about tomorrow. Each man carried approximately 60 pounds of gear. Rifle and ammunition, hand grenades, rations, water, entrenching tool, gas mask, extra socks, first aid kit. Some carried photographs. Some carried Bibles or prayer books. Some carried letters from home, already worn soft from being read and reread. And every man carried doubt. Doubt that the plan would work. Doubt that the beach was as lightly defended as the briefings suggested. Doubt that he'd survive. Doubt that he was good enough, strong enough, brave enough for what was coming. Sergeant John Robert Slaughter of the 29th Division later recalled, "We all acted tough. We joked and laughed and pretended we weren't scared. But when the lights went out that night, you could hear guys crying. Not loud, just quiet sobs in the darkness. And no one said anything because we all understood. We were all feeling the same thing, that this might be our last night alive. That tomorrow a lot of us would die. And there wasn't a damn thing we could do about it except try to be brave enough not to let our buddies down." And then morning came. Cold, gray, stormy. The loudspeakers crackled. Orders were shouted. And the men who would land at Omaha Beach. These farm boys and factory workers, these students and rangers, these sons and brothers and husbands and fathers, began climbing down the cargo nets into landing craft that would carry them toward destiny. They didn't know that the air bombardment had missed. They didn't know that the naval guns had been ineffective. They didn't know that the German 352nd Division was waiting in full strength. All they knew was that their country had asked them to do something impossible. And despite their fear, despite their doubt, despite everything, they were going to try. In the next episode, we're taking you on the crossing, the nightmare journey across the English Channel through 12-foot waves. The seasickness, the chaos, the equipment failures, and the growing realization that nothing was going according to plan. Episode 4, The Crossing, is where the terror truly begins. Because the battle didn't start when they hit the beach. It started the moment they left England. Subscribe now, share this video, and steel yourself. Because we're about to enter the storm. 12 miles. That's all that separated the Allied fleet from the French coast. 12 miles of dark, violent water. 12 miles that should have taken 90 minutes to cross. But nothing about D-Day went according to plan. And for the men crammed into landing craft designed for calm seas, those 12 miles became a rolling, pitching nightmare that destroyed equipment, scattered formations, and broke men's spirits before they ever saw the enemy. The crossing was supposed to be the easy part. It became a preview of hell. You've never experienced D-Day like this. In this episode, we're putting you inside a landing craft in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944. You'll feel the cold spray, smell the vomit and diesel fuel, hear the roar of engines and the crash of waves and the whispered prayers of men who knew they might not survive the next hour. The crossing broke the invasion plan before it even started. Equipment sank, men drowned, And by the time the first craft approached Omaha Beach, chaos had already won. Stay with us, because this is where the nightmare truly began. At 0300 hours, 3 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1944, the transport ships carrying the assault troops reached their positions roughly 12 miles off the coast of Normandy. This was called the transport area, the zone where the large ships would stop and the soldiers would transfer to landing craft for the final approach. The sea was rougher than anyone had anticipated. Waves crashed against the hulls of destroyers and transports, sending spray 30 feet into the air. Wind howled through the rigging. And somewhere beyond the darkness and the storm, beyond the horizon that no one could see, was France and Omaha Beach, and the Germans who'd been waiting for 2 years for this moment. The loading process was brutal. Cargo nets hung down the sides of the transports, swaying violently with every wave. Soldiers, burdened with 60 pounds of equipment, had to climb down these nets in the dark, timing their descent so they'd drop into the landing craft at the moment it rose on a wave, not when it dropped away, because misjudging that timing meant a fall of 20 feet onto steel. Several men lost their grip. Some landed badly, breaking ankles or legs. Others fell between the landing craft and the transport, where they were crushed as the sea slammed the vessels together. Their screams were swallowed by the wind. Their bodies vanished into the black water. And the loading continued, because there was no time to stop, no time to mourn. The landing craft themselves were marvels of military engineering and claustrophobic nightmares in equal measure. Officially designated LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, they were boxy steel boats 36 feet long with a ramp at the front that would drop when they hit the beach. Each craft could carry 36 men, packed shoulder to shoulder in a space barely 10 feet wide. There was no protection from the elements. No seats, just a steel hull and a prayer. The craft were powered by diesel engines that filled the air with fumes and rode low in the water, making them vulnerable to swamping. And in seas like this, with waves 10 to 12 feet high, the landing craft became rolling, pitching torture devices. Within minutes of leaving the transports, men began vomiting. The motion was relentless, violent, unpredictable. The craft would climb a wave, hang at the crest for a stomach-churning second, then plunge down the far side, slamming into the trough hard enough to rattle teeth. Spray soaked everyone. Cold Atlantic water, mixed with diesel and vomit, sloshed around their boots. Some men tried to bail with their helmets. Others gave up and just held on, faces green, praying for the nightmare to end. Sergeant Thomas Valance of the 1st Division later recalled, "I've never been so miserable in my life. We were packed in like sardines, soaked to the bone, freezing, puking our guts out. And all I could think was, please God, let us get to the beach so this stops. And then I realized that when we got to the beach, people were going to shoot at us. And I actually thought, maybe that'll be better than this." The plan called for the landing craft to form waves, organized groups that would hit the beach in a precise sequence. First wave at 0630, second wave at 0700, third wave at 0730. Each wave with specific objectives, specific sectors, specific units. But the storm scattered formations. Craft lost sight of each other in the darkness and the spray. Radios, soaked by seawater, stopped working. Compasses spun uselessly. And the coxswains, the Navy personnel steering the craft, did their best to navigate by dead reckoning and glimpses of other boats when the waves allowed. Some craft drifted miles off course. Others circled, trying to find their assigned positions. The carefully choreographed invasion became a confused race toward a shore no one could see clearly. As dawn began to break, gray light seeping into the eastern sky, the men caught their first glimpses of the French coastline. Low cliffs, bluffs covered in grass, and beyond the surf line, dark shapes that had to be the beach obstacles Rommel had planted. Steel and concrete and mines? Hundreds of them, thousands, a forest of death waiting just beneath the surface. The coxswains throttled up, trying to find paths through the obstacles while waves shoved the craft sideways and forward. Momentum became a battle against nature itself. Some craft struck obstacles and tore open their hulls, taking on water instantly. Others triggered mines, detonating in geysers of flame and shrapnel that sent men and equipment flying. The tanks were supposed to land first. 32 DD tanks, amphibious Sherman tanks fitted with flotation screens that allowed them to swim ashore, were launched from landing craft several thousand yards offshore. The theory was sound. The execution was disaster. The seas were too rough. The tanks, never designed for waves this size, began to founder immediately. Flotation screens collapsed. Engines flooded. One by one, the tanks sank, plunging to the bottom of the channel with their crews trapped inside. Some managed to escape the hatches and swim for the surface. Others drowned, entombed in steel coffins 60 feet underwater. Of the 32 DD tanks assigned to Omaha Beach, only 5 made it ashore. 27 sank. And with them went the fire support the infantry was counting on. Artillery pieces fared no better. Self-propelled howitzers, loaded onto specialized landing craft, were supposed to provide covering fire as the troops assaulted the beach. But several craft swamped in the heavy seas and sank. Others reached the beach only to bog down in soft sand or strike mines. By the time the first wave of infantry landed, they had almost no armor support, no mobile artillery, and no way to knock out the German bunkers that commanded the beach. The plan was falling apart, piece by piece, even before the shooting started, and through it all the men endured. Cold, wet, sick, terrified. They bailed water. They checked weapons that had been soaked by spray and probably wouldn't fire. They looked at each other's faces, pale and strained in the growing light, and saw their own fear reflected back. Some men prayed, others joked, desperate humor to mask the dread. A few stared at nothing, already retreating into shock. And the officers, hoarse from shouting orders that couldn't be heard over the engines and the wind, tried to project confidence they didn't feel. "We'll be fine," they shouted. "Stick together, follow the plan, and we'll be inland by noon." But their eyes told a different story. At approximately 06:20 hours, 10 minutes before H hour, the bombardment began. The sound was incredible. Naval guns on battleships and cruisers opened fire, sending shells screaming over the landing craft toward the shore. The men could feel the concussion in their chests, see the muzzle flashes lighting up the gray morning. Surely nothing could survive that, they thought. Surely the Germans were being blown to pieces. Surely when we land, the beach will be clear. But the shells were falling too far inland. The Navy, afraid of hitting the approaching landing craft, had adjusted their aim, and the bunkers, the machine gun nests, the mortars and artillery positions that lined Omaha Beach, remained untouched. At a 6:25, 5 minutes before H hour, the German coastal artillery opened fire. Massive guns, some as large as 155 mm, began bracketing the landing craft still 1,000 yards offshore. Shells exploded in the water, sending up columns of spray and shrapnel. One craft took a direct hit and disintegrated. Men and equipment vaporized in an instant. Another was struck near the bow, the ramp blown off, water pouring in as the craft began to sink. The coxswain tried to reach the beach, racing the clock against the rising water. He didn't make it. The craft went down 300 yards from shore. Some men, weighted with gear, sank immediately. Others struggled out of their packs and tried to swim, but the surf and the current pulled them under. A few made it, stumbling onto the beach half-drowned, weaponless, alone. And then, at 6:30 hours, exactly on schedule, the first wave hit Omaha Beach. 36 landing craft, 1,450 men, farm boys from Iowa, and factory workers from Detroit and students from Virginia. The ramps dropped. Machine gun fire erupted, and hell opened its mouth. What happened next was the worst disaster of D-Day. A bloodbath so complete, so overwhelming, that for several hours, Allied commanders considered abandoning Omaha entirely. In the next episode, we're taking you into the first wave. You'll see what the men saw. You'll hear the bullets and the screams, and you'll understand why Omaha Beach at 06:30 on the morning of June 6th became a slaughterhouse. Episode 5, Hell Opens at Dawn. It's the hardest episode in this series, but it's the most important, because this is what really happened. Subscribe now and prepare yourself, because the next episode is not for the faint of heart. Before we begin this episode, a warning. What you're about to hear is graphic. It's brutal. It's the unvarnished truth of what happened at Omaha Beach in the first hour of D-Day. Men died in ways that are difficult to describe and harder to forget. But this is their story, and they deserve to have it told truthfully, without sanitization, without Hollywood heroics, just the raw, terrible reality of 630 hours. June 6, 1944, when the first wave landed at Omaha and discovered that every plan, every assumption, every promise they'd been given was a lie. This is Hell Opens at Dawn, and if you want to understand D-Day, you need to watch this. Even if it hurts, the ramp dropped. That's all it took. 1 second, you were inside the landing craft, cramped but protected. The next second, the ramp crashed down onto the sand, and machine gun fire poured into the boat like water from a hose. Men in the front were hit before they took a single step. Cut down, still standing, bodies jerking with the impact of bullets. Behind them, men tried to push forward, tried to get off the boat, because staying inside meant certain death, and getting out meant probable death. There was no good choice, no right move, just chaos and blood and the realization dawning in a split second that they'd been sent into a trap. In this episode, we're not holding anything back. This is what really happened at Omaha Beach, and it's worse than you imagined. At 0630 hours, landing craft 815 approached Sector Easy Red on Omaha Beach. Inside the craft were 34 men of Company A, 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. They were National Guard troops from Virginia. Several had grown up in the same small town, gone to school together, enlisted together. Private First Class John Barnes was in that boat. So was his best friend, Corporal Henry Bedford. They'd promised each other's mothers they'd look after each other, make sure they both came home. The coxswain throttled back as the craft approached the shore, trying to find a path through the obstacles. German shells were exploding in the water all around them. Machine gun fire was kicking up spray, and then the bow grated on sand. The coxswain hit the ramp control, and the ramp dropped. Machine gun fire from 3 different positions converged on the open ramp. The German MG-42s, each firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, created what soldiers would later describe as a solid wall of bullets. Private Barnes, standing near the front, was hit 9 times before he could move. He died instantly. Corporal Bedford, right behind him, was shot through the head. The men behind them tried to dive over the sides of the craft into the water, anything to get out of the kill zone. But the water was 4 feet deep, and they were carrying 60 pounds of gear. Some men went under and didn't come up, drowned by the weight of their equipment. Others struggled forward, exhausted by the effort of wading through surf while bullets snapped past their heads. Of the 34 men in Landing Craft 815, only 7 made it to the beach alive. And they made it without weapons, without equipment, because they'd dropped everything just to keep their heads above water. All along Omaha Beach. The scene repeated with minor variations, but the same horrific result. Company A of the 116th Regiment lost 96% of its effective strength in the first 15 minutes. 96%. 6 companies landed in the first wave. 4 of them were combat ineffective within minutes, shattered by casualties and scattered across the beach. Officers were hit. Sergeants were hit. Radios were destroyed by bullets or soaked by seawater. Communication collapsed instantly. No one knew where they were supposed to be. No one could contact anyone else. And the German machine guns never stopped firing. The beach itself offered almost no cover. 300 yards of open sand stretched from the waterline to the seawall. 300 yards, where the only obstacles were the bodies of men who'd tried to cross and failed. Some soldiers crawled, dragging themselves forward inches at a time, trying to stay low. But the German positions on the bluffs had perfect fields of fire. They could see everything. Mortar teams adjusted their aim, dropping shells onto clusters of men. Artillery pieces fired directly at landing craft, destroying them before the ramps even dropped. And snipers picked off anyone who looked like an officer or who was trying to rally troops. Private Harold Baumgarten, who we met in Episode 3, landed at 0635 hours. His landing craft hit a sandbar 100 yards from shore. The ramp dropped into neck-deep water. The men tried to wade in, but the current was fierce, and the weight of their equipment pulled them down. Baumgarten saw the man next to him, a kid from Brooklyn named Paul Stern, step off the ramp and vanish beneath the surface. Just gone. No scream, no struggle. Just gone. Baumgarten made it to the beach, crawled behind a steel obstacle and looked around. Bodies everywhere, men screaming for medics. A soldier with no legs trying to drag himself toward the seawall. Another sitting in the surf, holding his intestines in his hands, staring at them like he couldn't understand what had happened. Baumgarten was shot in the face minutes later, the bullet taking off his left cheek. He survived, but he'd carry the scars forever. The plan had called for engineers to land with the first wave and blow gaps through the obstacles so follow-on waves could advance. But the engineers were being slaughtered along with the infantry. Gap assault teams, 16 men each, tasked with destroying the Belgian gates and hedgehogs, took staggering casualties. One team was wiped out entirely when a mortar round landed in their midst. Another team made it to the obstacles only to discover that rifle fire was detonating their explosives prematurely. Engineers worked frantically, trying to set charges while bullets sparked off the steel around them. Some succeeded in blowing gaps, but most gaps weren't marked because the men who were supposed to place the markers were dead. So follow-on landing craft, not knowing where the gaps were, hit obstacles and mines just like the first wave. Medics ran onto the beach with Red Cross armbands and no weapons, just medical bags. The Geneva Convention was supposed to protect them. The Germans ignored it, shooting medics along with everyone else. Some medics were hit while treating wounded soldiers. Others were killed trying to drag injured men to safety. Corporal Thomas Breeden, a medic with the 1st Division, ran back and forth across a 50-yard stretch of beach for 20 minutes, pulling wounded men behind cover, applying tourniquets, injecting morphine, until a sniper shot him through the chest. He died doing his job, trying to save lives under fire that would have made most combat soldiers seek cover. By 0700 hours, 30 minutes into the assault, Omaha Beach was a disaster zone. Hundreds of men were dead. Hundreds more were wounded, lying in the surf or behind obstacles, calling for help that couldn't reach them. Equipment littered the sand. Rifles jammed with sand and salt water. Radios didn't work. Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosives designed to blow through barbed wire, lay scattered and unused because the men trained to use them were casualties. Tanks that had made it ashore were burning, struck by German anti-tank weapons. And the follow-on waves were still coming, landing on a beach choked with the dead and dying, adding to the chaos. Leadership was decimated. Company commanders were dead or wounded. Platoon leaders were gone. Small groups of men huddled behind the seawall or steel obstacles, leaderless, shell-shocked, unsure what to do. Some were teenagers who'd frozen, unable to process the horror around them. Others were veterans who'd seen combat before, but nothing like this. The noise was indescribable. Machine gun fire, explosions, screams, the whistle of incoming artillery shells, the crash of surf, and underneath it all, a low, constant moaning from the wounded. It was the sound of hell, and still, men tried. Not because they were heroes, not because they were fearless, but because the beach was a death trap, and the only way to survive was to move forward, to get off the killing ground, to climb the bluffs and silence the German positions that were shredding them. Small groups began to advance. 10 men here, 5 men there, crawling through the sand. Using the bodies of their comrades as cover, a grim reality no one talked about but everyone understood. They'd throw grenades at German positions, fire rifles at muzzle flashes, and inch forward, paying for every yard with blood. Brigadier General Norman Cota landed at 0720 hours, 51 years old, 1 star on his helmet, walking calmly through a storm of bullets because he believed that if his men saw him afraid, they'd break. He found a group of soldiers pinned down behind the seawall, paralyzed with fear. And he shouted at them. 2 kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now get off your butts and move. He grabbed a Bangalore torpedo himself, showed them how to place it, and blew a gap through the barbed wire. Then he walked through the gap, upright, not even crouching, and waved for the men to follow. Some did, and that was the beginning, not of victory, but of resistance. By 800 hours, 90 minutes into the assault, Omaha Beach was balanced on, a knife's edge between total disaster and desperate survival. Allied commanders offshore were receiving scattered, contradictory reports. Some said the beach was secure, others reported complete failure. General Omar Bradley, aboard the USS Augusta, considered evacuating Omaha and redirecting troops to Utah Beach or the British sectors. It was that bad. But he decided to wait, to give the men on the ground one more hour. And in that hour, something extraordinary happened. Not through planning or superior tactics or overwhelming force, but through sheer, stubborn courage. The first wave had been shattered. Hundreds dead, communications broken, the plan in ruins. But against all odds, small groups of men were beginning to fight back. In the next episode, The Broken Plan, we'll show you how chaos turned into improvisation, how leaderless soldiers became their own leaders, and how the worst military disaster of D-Day set the stage for one of its greatest victories. Stay with us. Subscribe. Because the battle for Omaha Beach is just beginning, and the story of what happens next will restore your faith in the human spirit. The plan was dead. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. The air bombardment missed. The naval guns fired too far inland. The DD tanks sank. The engineers were slaughtered. Communications collapsed. Officers were dead. And hundreds of American soldiers were pinned down on a beach that was supposed to be secured in 30 minutes. It was 800 hours. 2 hours until high tide. And if the Allies didn't break through soon, the rising water would drown the wounded and crush the survivors against the seawall, where German gunners could massacre them at leisure. Omaha Beach was lost, except no one told the men still fighting. This episode is about what happens when everything falls apart, when the general's plan means nothing, when there's no cavalry coming, when it's just you and a handful of strangers pinned down, outgunned, facing an enemy that has every advantage. This is the story of improvisation under fire, of junior officers and sergeants and privates who became leaders because the leaders were gone, of men who decided that dying on the beach was unacceptable, even if dying while attacking the bluffs was probable. This is how Omaha Beach was saved. Not by following the plan, but by throwing it out and making a new one, on the fly, under the worst conditions imaginable. At 800 hours on June 6, 1944, Colonel George Taylor, commanding officer of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Division, waded ashore on Omaha Beach. He was supposed to have landed 30 minutes earlier, but his landing craft had been delayed by the chaos offshore. When the ramp dropped, Taylor stepped onto a beach that looked like a vision of the apocalypse. Bodies everywhere. Burning vehicles, men huddled behind obstacles, shell-shocked, wounded soldiers crawling through the surf, and German machine gun fire raking the sand from multiple directions. Taylor assessed the situation in seconds. The plan was worthless. They'd have to make it up as they went. He found a group of soldiers crouched behind a steel hedgehog, frozen with fear, and he shouted words that would become legendary. "There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach. The dead, and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't inspiring in a Hollywood sense. But it was exactly what those men needed to hear. A clear statement of their choices. Stay here and die slowly, or attack and maybe die quickly. But at least die doing something. Some men stood up and followed him. Others remained frozen. But enough moved that it created momentum. All along the beach, similar scenes were unfolding. Junior officers, seeing their commanders dead, took charge. Sergeants who'd never led more than a squad suddenly found themselves commanding what was left of a company. And privates, ordinary riflemen, made individual decisions to move forward because staying put was suicide. There was no coordination, no grand strategy, just small groups, 10 men here, 15 men there, identifying a German position, figuring out how to approach it, and attacking with whatever they had. Sergeant Philip Strechik of the 2nd Ranger Battalion was one of those improvisers. He'd landed on the wrong section of beach, separated from his unit, weaponless because he'd lost his rifle in the water. He found 4 other Rangers in the same situation. They scrounged weapons from the dead, a carbine here, a bar there, a few grenades. Then they looked up at the bluffs. Stretchik pointed to a German machine gun position firing down on the beach. "We can't stay here," he said. "We go up or we die down here. Your choice." They went up, crawling through the grass, using smoke from burning vehicles as cover. It took them 40 minutes to climb 200 feet of cliff. But when they reached the machine gun nest, they killed the crew with grenades and silenced a weapon that had been killing Americans for 2 hours. No officers told them to do it. No one gave them orders. They just saw a problem and solved it. The bluffs were honeycombed with draws, natural gullies that ran from the beach up to the top of the cliffs. These draws were the key to breaking through. Roads ran through them, paths inland that vehicles could use. But the Germans had fortified every draw heavily, knowing the Allies would try to advance through them. Concrete bunkers guarded the draws. Barbed wire blocked them. Minefields covered the approaches. And machine gun positions on either side created crossfires that made frontal assault suicidal. The original plan called for engineers to clear these draws systematically, but the engineers were decimated. So the infantry had to do it themselves, with no specialized training and minimal equipment. At the Vierville Draw, the westernmost exit from the beach, a traffic jam of disabled vehicles and casualties blocked the road. German artillery had ranged the draw perfectly, dropping shells onto it every few minutes. No one wanted to go near it. But Colonel Charles Canham of the 116th Infantry, wounded in the wrist but still functioning, rallied a group of men. "We're going to take that draw," he announced. "If we don't, we're stuck on this beach forever." He didn't wait for volunteers. He just started walking toward the draw, and men followed because what else could they do? German fire cut them down. Canham was hit again, this time in the shoulder. He kept going. They reached the fortifications, used satchel charges to blow gaps in the wire, and fought through the German positions in brutal close-quarters combat. By 0900 hours, the Vierville Draw was in American hands. Barely, tenuously. But it was open. Similar fights erupted at the other draws. At the Colville Draw, engineers finally managed to get a bulldozer up to the barbed wire and simply pushed it aside, clearing a path. At the St. Laurent Draw, Rangers and infantry combined forces, flanking the German bunkers from both sides simultaneously. The Germans fought hard. They had the advantage of position and preparation. But they were outnumbered, and once the Americans started getting close, the Germans' superior firepower mattered less. It came down to grenades and bayonets and sheer determination. Naval support finally began to make a difference around 0900 hours. Destroyers, frustrated by the lack of progress and the desperate radio calls from shore, took extraordinary risks. They came in close, so close they risked running aground and fired directly at German bunkers at point-blank range. USS Frankfurt literally beached itself, using its 5-inch guns to blast apart fortifications that had withstood earlier bombardment. The Germans, who'd been nearly immune to naval fire from 12 miles out, suddenly found themselves under devastating attack from destroyers barely 1,000 yards offshore. Bunkers that had held all morning were blown apart. Machine gun nests were obliterated, and the pressure on the beach eased, just enough for more men to advance. By 1,000 hours, 4 hours into the assault, the situation on Omaha remained desperate, but was no longer hopeless. The beach was still under fire. Wounded still covered the sand. Follow-on waves were still struggling to land. But American troops were on top of the bluffs. Not in large numbers, not in organized units, just small groups scattered across a 5-mile front, fighting isolated battles against German strong points. But they were inland. The breakout had begun. Command and control was non-existent. Generals offshore had no idea what was happening. Radios were still mostly dead. Couriers sent to the beach often never returned. So commanders made decisions based on guesswork and prayer. General Clarence Hubner, commanding the 1st Division, sent every available reserve unit to Omaha, gambling that more men would tip the balance. He was right, but barely. The beach was so congested with troops, vehicles, and casualties that landing additional waves became a nightmare. Craft had to navigate through obstacles, bodies, and burning wreckage. Some gave up and landed men wherever they could find space. Organization didn't matter anymore. Unit integrity didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was getting men off the beach and up the bluffs. Brigadier General Norman Cota, who we've seen before, spent the entire morning moving along the beach, rallying troops. He was everywhere, seemingly immune to the bullets and shells that killed men around him. He found a group of rangers pinned behind the seawall and led them personally through a minefield, walking upright, daring fate. He found a flamethrower team that had lost their officer and showed them how to use their weapon to burn out a bunker. He found stragglers from different units and formed them into ad hoc assault teams, pointing at German positions and saying, "That one, you five, go kill it." His presence, his calm in the chaos, inspired men who'd given up hope. Later, someone asked Cota if he'd been scared. He admitted, "I was terrified, but I couldn't let them see that. If I broke, they'd break. So I just kept walking." And slowly, yard by yard, the Americans pushed inland. They bypassed strong points they couldn't reduce, leaving them for follow-on units. They used every tactic they'd been taught and invented new ones on the spot. Smoke grenades to obscure their movements, covering fire to pin down German machine guns, flanking maneuvers through brush and grass. Nothing fancy, nothing textbook. Just basic infantry combat executed by exhausted, terrified men who refused to quit. By noon, the crisis had passed. Omaha Beach was still a disaster, still a scene of carnage. But it was an American disaster. The Germans were being pushed back. Reinforcements were landing, and the foothold, paid for with so much blood, was secure. In the next episode, we'll show you the heroes who turned the tide, the Medal of Honor recipients, the ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things, the men whose courage, in those darkest hours, saved Omaha Beach. Episode 7. Courage in the Sand. These are the names you need to know. Subscribe now, because their stories deserve to be told. I'll create a powerful 12-14-minute documentary, script focused on individual heroism at Omaha Beach. This will follow the same high-quality format as your previous episodes with hooks, narratives, and emotional depth. At 8:30 a.m. on Omaha Beach, a single man stood up. While thousands cowered behind steel obstacles and the bodies of their friends, Brigadier General Norman Cota walked upright through machine gun fire. He wasn't superhuman. He was terrified. But he understood something the others hadn't realized yet. Staying still meant certain death. Moving forward at least gave them a chance. What happened next would define the word courage for generations. By 8 a.m., Omaha Beach wasn't a battle anymore. It was a massacre frozen in time. Over 3,000 men huddled against a seawall that offered maybe 3 feet of protection. Behind them, bodies floated in the surf. Ahead, the bluffs bristled with German guns that had killed hundreds in the first hour. And all around them, paralysis. Combat historian S.L.A. Marshall would later write that Omaha Beach came within minutes of becoming America's greatest military disaster. The invasion was collapsing not because soldiers lacked courage, but because they lacked leadership. Company commanders were dead. Lieutenants were scattered. Radio operators drowned before reaching shore. For the first time that morning, ordinary men would have to become extraordinary. Norman Cota was 51 years old, ancient by D-Day standards. As Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, he could have coordinated the invasion from a command ship. Instead, at 7:30 a.m., he climbed into a landing craft with the second wave. Private Jack Ingram watched Cota's boat approach. Dog White Sector. I saw this older guy step off into waist-deep water like he was walking into a hotel lobby. Bullets were hitting everywhere. He just kept coming, cigar in his mouth, pistol in his hand. I remember thinking, that man is either crazy or he knows something we don't. What Cota knew was simple. Someone had to move first. He reached the seawall and found Rangers from the 5th Battalion pinned down alongside regular infantry. Men stared at him in disbelief, not just because a general had landed under fire, but because he was standing upright while bullets cracked overhead. Cota grabbed a Bangalore torpedo, an explosive device used to blast through barbed wire, and turned to the men around him. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice somehow calm above the chaos, "we are being killed here. Let's move inland and get killed." It wasn't eloquence. It was mathematics. More men died staying still than moving forward. The German gunners had every inch of the beach pre-sighted. But if they rushed the bluffs, at least some would make it. Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, commander of the 5th Rangers, looked at Coda and said, "General, I think we can do that." Coda's response became legend. "Lead the way, Rangers." At 8:45 a.m., a small group of men followed Coda up a narrow draw called Dog 1. They crawled through barbed wire. They threw grenades into German bunkers. They climbed when their bodies screamed to stop, and slowly, impossibly, the beach began to move. While generals led men forward, medics ran sideways, directly into fire to reach the wounded. Medic Robert Wright landed with Company A at 6:45 a.m. Within minutes, 90% of his company was dead or wounded. Wright spent the next 4 hours crawling from body to body in the surf, dragging men toward cover. "You couldn't think about the bullets," he recalled. "All you heard were men calling for help. Boys calling for their mothers." That sound, you never forget that sound. Wright treated 27 men that morning. He was shot twice, but refused evacuation until darkness fell. Medic Cecil Breeden performed an emergency amputation behind a steel obstacle while machine gun fire kicked up sand around him. When he ran out of morphine, he held dying men's hands and lied to them, told them they'd be fine, told them the pain would stop soon. The Geneva Convention marked medics as non-combatants. But German gunners on Omaha Beach didn't honor those rules. Medics became priority targets because they represented hope, and the Germans wanted to kill hope. Yet they kept running. Red crosses on white armbands, unarmed, sprinting toward screams while everyone else ran from bullets. By day's end, 60% of the medics who landed at Omaha Beach were casualties themselves. But their courage saved hundreds of lives. Technician 5th grade John Pinder was a radio operator with the 16th Infantry Regiment. His job, land communications equipment to coordinate naval gunfire support. Without radios, the destroyers offshore couldn't help. Pinder's landing craft hit a sandbar 100 yards from shore. He jumped into chest-deep water carrying a 60-pound radio. Almost immediately, machine gun fire ripped through his unit. He was hit in the leg. He kept moving. He reached the beach, set up the radio, and began calling fire coordinates to the destroyers. Then a mortar blast destroyed the radio and wounded him in the shoulder. Most men would have been evacuated. Pinder waded back into the surf, back into the killing zone, to retrieve another radio from a destroyed landing craft. He was hit again, this time in the chest. He crawled forward anyway, dragging the radio, blood soaking the sand. He transmitted crucial coordinates that allowed naval guns to destroy 2 German bunkers. Only then did he allow medics to reach him. He died 30 minutes later. Pinder received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation reads, "His courageous determination to fulfill his mission, despite repeated severe wounds, enabled vital communications to be established. But numbers tell the real story. Pinder's radio calls directed fire that saved an estimated 300 lives. 1 man, 3 wounds, 300 saved." 6 miles west of Omaha Beach, another impossible task awaited. Point du Hoc. German guns positioned on this 100-foot cliff could devastate both Omaha and Utah beaches. Someone had to scale those cliffs and destroy those guns. That someone was 225 Army Rangers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder. They landed at 7:10 a.m., 40 minutes late because of rough seas. German soldiers above them cut the Rangers' ropes. They threw grenades down the cliff face. They fired directly into men hanging from ropes like targets in a shooting gallery. But Rangers kept climbing. First Sergeant Leonard Lommel reached the top with a dozen men. They fought through trenches to reach the gun emplacements and discovered something shocking. The guns were gone. The Germans had moved them inland to protect them from naval bombardment. Most commanders would have radioed success and held position. Lommel did something different. He left the relative safety of the bunkers and moved inland alone to find those guns. He found them, hidden in an orchard, unguarded, ready to fire, with nothing but thermite grenades. Lommel destroyed the gun's firing mechanisms. Then he ran back through German lines to report success. Of the 225 Rangers who landed at Pointe du Hoc, only 90 could still fight by the end of D-Day. But they'd completed their impossible mission. General Omar Bradley would later call it the single most important achievement on D-Day, all because one sergeant refused to accept mission accomplished until the actual mission was accomplished. Leadership matters. Individual heroism inspires, but battles are won by ordinary men doing extraordinary things together. By 10 a.m., small groups across Omaha Beach were moving. Not in organized waves, the invasion plan was dead. But in clusters of 5, 10, 20 men who decided dying on their feet beat dying on their knees. Private Harold Baumgarten described the moment. I saw a lieutenant I didn't know stand up and start walking forward. Just walking like he was late for dinner. Then another guy got up. Then another. Nobody ordered us. We just went. Engineers blew gaps in barbed wire. Infantry cleared trenches. Bangalore torpedoes destroyed obstacles. Each small success enabled the next. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't coordinated. But it was working. By noon, American soldiers held the bluffs in 4 places. By 1 p.m., they'd pushed a half-mile inland. The unstoppable German defense was collapsing, not because of overwhelming force, but because individual courage had become collective momentum. But courage isn't free. It's purchased with blood. By nightfall on June 6th, over 2,400 Americans were dead, wounded, or missing at Omaha Beach alone. That's more than the entire Revolutionary War Battle of Bunker Hill, more than any single day of the Civil War Battle of Antitrust Creek. Some died in the first seconds, drowning under the weight of their equipment. Some died inches from safety, shot while climbing the bluffs. Some died after the beach was secure, bleeding out while waiting for evacuation. Each one had a name. Each one had a family who wouldn't know they were dead for days. Each one believed they'd survive, because everyone believes they'll survive until the moment they don't. Captain Robert Walker of Company A wrote in his after-action report, "I landed with 205 men. By evening, I could account for 21 who were still combat effective. I don't know if we won or lost. I just know what it cost. What it cost was a generation's worth of fathers, brothers, and sons compressed into 12 hours of hell. But what they bought was a foothold, a chance, a future." The heroes of Omaha Beach didn't overthink courage. They didn't wait for perfect conditions or clear orders. They saw what needed to be done and did it, even when every instinct screamed to stop. General Cota standing in, machine gun fire. Medic Wright crawling through, the surf toward screams. Technician. Pinder dragging a radio after being shot 3 times. Sergeant Lomel hunting guns alone behind enemy lines. These weren't superhuman acts. They were human acts performed under superhuman pressure. And their example turned a massacre into a victory. That evening, as the sun set over Omaha Beach, soldiers sat among the wreckage and tried to process what they'd survived. The sand was stained dark. The tide was pulling bodies back out to sea. The smell of death hung in the salt air. But they were alive, and they were moving inland. One soldier wrote home that night, "I don't know if I'm brave or just lucky. I don't know if what we did today mattered in the grand scheme of things. I just know that when it mattered most, when everything said to quit, we didn't." That's courage in its purest form. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make your decisions. Next time, we'll explore what came after courage, how the afternoon of June 6th became the turning point, how naval destroyers risked everything to support the men on shore, how reinforcements finally arrived, and how, slowly, impossibly, Omaha Beach transformed from a killing ground into a victory. Because courage opens doors, but it takes something else to walk through them. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. These heroes deserve to be remembered, and their stories deserve to be told. Empty beach at sunset. At 12:30 p.m. on June 6, 1944, destroyer USS Frankfurt did something that violated every rule in the Navy's playbook. Captain James Semmes ordered his ship into water so shallow that one wrong turn would tear open the hull. German artillery immediately zeroed in on them. His executive officer begged him to pull back. Semmes looked toward Omaha Beach, where thousands of men were still pinned down, and said 4 words: "We're not leaving them." What happened next turned the tide of D-Day. but it would take hours for anyone on that beach to realize they'd already won. By noon, Omaha Beach was still a bloodbath. Yes, small groups had reached the bluffs. Yes, the German defense was cracking. But progress was measured in yards, and casualties were still mounting. The original invasion plan called for naval destroyers to stay 10,000 yards offshore, safe from German coastal guns, providing long-range artillery support. But from 2 miles away, they couldn't see targets clearly. They couldn't help the men dying on the beach. On the command ship USS Augusta, Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant received increasingly desperate radio calls. "We're getting slaughtered. We need fire support closer. German bunker at grid reference. We can't advance without naval guns. For God's sake, get those destroyers in here." Bryant faced an impossible choice. Send destroyers into shallow water and risk losing ships, worth millions of dollars, or watch thousands of soldiers die because they couldn't knock out German strong points. He made his decision at 12:00 p.m. All destroyers, close the beach. Take out those bunkers. I don't care how shallow you have to go. At 12:15 p.m., 10 American destroyers turned toward shore and went to full speed. USS McCook, Carmack, Doyle, Frankfurt, Harding, Satterley, Thompson, Baldwin, Emmons, and Frankfurt drove into water never meant for ships their size. Sailors in the engine rooms could hear the hull scraping on sandbars. Depth alarms screamed. One wrong move and they'd run aground, sitting. Ducks for German artillery. But they kept coming. At 800 yards from shore, point-blank range by naval standards, they opened fire. Lieutenant Commander Ralph Ramey on the McCook described it. "We were so close I could see individual German soldiers running between bunkers. Our 5-inch guns were firing directly into concrete emplacements. We weren't providing artillery support anymore. We were in a knife fight. The effect was devastating. German bunkers that had survived hours of bombardment from 10,000 yards out couldn't withstand direct fire at 800 yards. 5-inch shells punched through concrete. 40-millimeter guns raked trenches. The entire bluff line erupted in explosions. German Commander Colonel Ernst Goth radioed his headquarters. "American destroyers have moved to suicidal range. We are under direct naval gunfire. Request immediate air support," but there was no air support. The Luftwaffe was already beaten. The bunkers were on their own. What made the destroyer assault decisive wasn't just firepower, it was precision. Shore-fire control parties, small. Teams of soldiers equipped with radios crawled to positions where they could see German strongpoints. They'd call in targets, bunker at Dog Green, 100 yards up from high water mark. Troops pinned down 50 yards in front of it. Destroyers would adjust fire in real time. First shot, 50 yards long. Second shot, 25 yards short. Third shot, direct hit. The Frankfurt alone destroyed 11 German positions in 90 minutes. The Carmack suppressed an entire network of machine gun nests that had dominated Easy Red sector all morning, and critically, the psychological effect was immediate. German soldiers who'd felt invincible behind concrete walls suddenly faced 2,000-pound shells coming through the ceiling. They abandoned positions. They surrendered. They ran. Private Franz Gockel, a German defender, later wrote, "We had stopped the Americans all morning. We thought we were winning. Then the warships came so close we could see their hulls. That's when we knew we'd lost." While destroyers pounded German defenses, something equally important was happening on the beach. Organization was replacing chaos. The afternoon landing waves, originally scheduled to pour ashore behind a secured beachhead, instead landed into an active battlefield. But unlike the morning waves, these men had leaders waiting for them. Combat engineers had marked safe lanes through beach obstacles with white tape. Military police directed traffic. Medical stations were operating. Ammunition was being distributed. It was still dangerous. German artillery still fell randomly, but it was no longer random chaos. Captain Joseph Dawson, who'd led men off the beach that morning, was back on the shore organizing the afternoon waves. I grabbed every lieutenant I could find and said, "Your men go up that draw. Those men go up that path. Don't bunch up. Keep moving." It wasn't elegant, but it worked. By 2 p.m., reinforcements were moving inland within minutes of landing instead of being pinned down for hours. The 115th Infantry Regiment landed at 1:30 p.m. expecting a bloodbath. Instead, they faced German artillery and snipers, deadly but manageable. They pushed inland within 45 minutes. The 18th Infantry Regiment landed at 2 p.m. and moved directly to exploit gaps that morning units had opened. By 3 p.m., over 25,000 American soldiers were ashore. The German defenders numbered less than 3,000. The math had shifted. For the German defenders, the afternoon was a nightmare of cascading failures. Their artillery observers, the men who directed fire onto the beach, were dead or driven from their positions by naval gunfire. Without eyes, German artillery became random and ineffective. Their communications network was shattered. Officers couldn't coordinate between strong points. They didn't know where Americans had broken through or where reinforcements were needed, and most critically, the reinforcements weren't coming. German doctrine called for immediate armored counterattacks to drive invaders back into the sea. But the 352nd Infantry Division had no tanks nearby. The panzer divisions that could have made a difference were held back, some by Hitler's personal order, others by systematic Allied deception that convinced German high command the real invasion was still coming at Calais. General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, commander of the 352nd, realized by 2 p.m. that his division was fighting alone. He requested permission to withdraw to better defensive positions inland. The request was denied. German doctrine demanded, hold the coast at all costs. So German soldiers held their positions and died in them, while American forces flowed around them like water around stones. By 4 p.m., American soldiers controlled most of the bluff line overlooking Omaha Beach. Small groups worked methodically, clearing trenches, bunkers, and machine gun nests. They used tactics learned in training and improvised on the spot, throw grenades into bunkers, wait for explosions, rush in with rifles ready, clear the position. Move to the next one. German resistance was collapsing into isolated pockets. Some positions fought to the last man. Others surrendered at the first opportunity. There was no coordinated defense anymore, just individual soldiers deciding whether dying for Hitler was worth it. By 5 p.m., American soldiers were looking down at Omaha Beach from the German perspective, and they finally understood how anyone had survived the morning. Sergeant Harry Parley stood in a German bunker that afternoon. The firing slits had perfect views of the beach. You could see every inch. I looked down at where I'd landed that morning and thought, how did any of us make it? How? The answer was courage, luck, and the fact that there's no defensive position that can't be flanked, no bunker that can't be destroyed, and no army that can win when the sea behind your enemy carries infinite reinforcements. By sunset, Omaha Beach was secure. The question was no longer, can we hold the beach? But how fast can we move inland? The invasion, nearly destroyed that morning, was succeeding. There's a strange moment in combat, veterans describe it across wars, when you realize you've survived. Something you shouldn't have. For the men on Omaha Beach, that realization came in waves throughout the afternoon. For some, it was watching reinforcements pour ashore while German guns stayed silent. For others, it was reaching the top of the bluffs and discovering the Germans were retreating. For many, it was simply sitting down as sunset approached and noticing they were still breathing. Private Robert Sales wrote that night, around 6 p.m., I realized I wasn't going to die today. All day, I'd been certain, absolutely certain I had maybe an hour left, maybe minutes. Then the firing slowed. Then it stopped. And I was still here. But survival came with its own psychological weight. Why them? Why were they alive when so many others weren't? There's no good answer to that question. Luck, positioning, random chance, nothing satisfying. Nothing that makes sense. Sergeant Thomas Valance described it. My best friend died in the first wave. Took a bullet 30 seconds after the ramp dropped. I made it 12 hours without a scratch. Same boat, same training, same everything, except he's dead and I'm not. How do you process that? You don't, not that day. Maybe not ever. As evening settled over Omaha Beach, the true cost of the day became impossible to ignore. Bodies still floated in the surf. The tide was coming in, covering the blood-stained sand, but bringing wreckage and dead men back with each wave. Medics worked through the night, treating hundreds of wounded who'd waited all day for evacuation. Some would make it. Some had waited too long, and everywhere, scattered across the beach and the bluffs, were the remnants of mourning optimism. Letters from home now soaked in seawater or blood, photographs of wives and children, dog tags on men who'd never answer to their names again. Companies that landed with 200 men reported 40 able to fight. The 116th Infantry Regiment's company landed with 205 men. By evening, 21 combat effective, 97 dead, 87 wounded or missing. The 1st Infantry Division's 16th Regiment took 60% casualties in some companies. Overall estimates, 2,400. American casualties at Omaha Beach on June 6th, roughly 1,000 dead. But even those numbers don't capture it. They can't, because each number was a person who woke up that morning believing they'd live to see tomorrow. In the days before D-Day, soldiers wrote letters home, letters to be sent if they didn't survive. Dear Mom, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. I want you to know I wasn't afraid. To my wife, you were the best thing that ever happened to me. Tell our daughter about me. Dad, I hope I made you proud. Hundreds of these letters were sent in the weeks after June 6th. Notifications delivered by telegram or military personnel in dress uniforms knocking on doors. The terrible mathematics of war. For every soldier who died, dozens of people back home would spend the rest of their lives with a hole that could never be filled. But on June 6th, in those final hours as darkness fell over Omaha Beach, the survivors didn't think about letters or statistics. They thought about the immediate. Get off this beach, find water, find food, check your weapon, try to sleep, try not to think about tomorrow, because tomorrow they'd have to do it all again. Push inland, fight for every field and hedgerow in Normandy. Keep moving forward on legs that barely worked and with minds that wanted nothing more than to shut down. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, they were alive, and that would have to be enough. The afternoon of June 6, 1944 was when Omaha Beach, transformed from America's worst nightmare into an unstoppable advance. It wasn't one thing that turned the tide. It was everything all at once. Destroyers that risked their ships to save soldiers, reinforcements that poured ashore when chaos gave way to organization. German defenses that collapsed when isolated. Strong points couldn't coordinate, and soldiers who simply refused to stay dead on that beach. By nightfall, the beachhead was 1.5 miles deep and 6 miles wide. Not the 8 miles planned, but enough. Enough to land more troops. Enough to bring in tanks and artillery. Enough to start the liberation of Europe. But there was no celebration that evening. No cheering. No sense of victory. Just exhausted men sitting in foxholes eating cold rations and trying not to think about the friends who weren't there anymore. War correspondent Ernie Pyle walked Omaha Beach at sunset and wrote, "I walked for a mile along the water's edge. The wreckage was vast and startling, but it was the little things that broke you. A tennis racket, a single shoe, a photograph of a girl, each one representing someone who'd thought they were going home." Next episode, we'll talk about what Omaha Beach left behind. Not just the tactical victory, but the human cost. The medics who stayed until they collapsed. The beach at sunset covered in the wounded and dying. The letters that were never sent. And how the survivors carried that day with them for the rest of their lives. Because winning isn't the same as healing. And sometimes the cost of victory is almost too much to bear. If these stories matter to you, please subscribe. These men sacrificed everything. The least we can do is remember. Omaha Beach at sunset. Silhouettes of soldiers in the distance. Waves washing gently against the shore. Subscribe button. Next episode preview at 9 p.m. on June 6, 1944. The sun finally set over Omaha Beach. For 12 hours, this stretch of sand had been the loudest, most violent place on Earth. Now as darkness fell, an eerie quiet settled over the coast. But the silence was worse than the noise had been, because in the quiet, you could hear the wounded calling out. You could hear medics working frantically. You could hear the waves bringing bodies back to shore, and you could hear survivors trying and failing not to cry. This is the story no one wanted to tell. The cost. The real cost. Not the statistics that go in history books, but the human beings those statistics represent. Because D-Day wasn't just won, it was paid for, and the bill came due in blood. Let's start with the numbers, because as cold and clinical as they are, they're important. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. Approximately 34,000 troops landed, 2,400 casualties, roughly 1,000 confirmed dead by nightfall. Another 400 would die from wounds in the following days. That's a 7% casualty rate overall. But statistics lie when they're too broad, because casualties weren't evenly distributed. If you landed in the first wave at Dog Green Sector, where Company A of the 116th Infantry came ashore, the casualty rate was over 90%. If you landed at 4 p.m. at Easy Red after destroyers had cleared German bunkers, you might make it inland without seeing combat. The randomness was almost worse than the violence. Your survival depended entirely on which boat you were assigned to, which sector you landed at, and what minute your ramp dropped. Luck. That's what decided who lived and who died. No amount of training, courage, or skill could save you if you stepped off your landing craft directly into a machine gun's field of fire. And 1,000 men stepped into exactly that. Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment deserves special mention. They were part of the Virginia National Guard, men who'd grown up together in the small town of Bedford, Virginia. Population 3,200. Company landed at Dog Green Sector at 6:36 a.m., directly in front of the most fortified German position on Omaha Beach. They were the tip of the spear, the first to die. In the first 30 seconds, half the company was killed or wounded. Within 15 minutes, 19 out of the 23 Bedford boys were dead. By day's end, Company A, 205 men, had 21 soldiers still able to fight. 97 were dead. 87 wounded or missing. Bedford, Virginia lost more men per capita on D-Day than any other town in America. In a community of 3,200 people, 19 families received telegrams in the same week. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son, one street in Bedford, Main Street, lost 5 boys. The town barbershop lost 2 employees. The local high school lost 7 graduates from the class of 1942. This is what statistics look like when you zoom in. This is what acceptable casualties means when it's your town, your neighbors, your sons. Bedford, Virginia never recovered. How could it? For the medics working through the night, the casualties weren't numbers. They were choices. This man or that man, treat the soldier who might survive or comfort the one who's dying. Spend morphine on someone salvageable or give it to someone in agony with no hope. These weren't theoretical questions. These were decisions made hundreds of times in the darkness while men screamed for help. You couldn't give them all. Medic Charles Shea treated wounded for 18 straight hours. You'd stabilize one man, move to the next, and hear the first one calling for you again. You couldn't save everyone. You couldn't even save most. So you made choices, and every choice haunted you. By dawn on June 7th, medics had created a massive aid station behind the seawall. Over 400 wounded men lay in rows, waiting for evacuation boats that came too slowly. Some waited hours, some waited too long. The medics kept working, beyond exhaustion, beyond emotion, beyond anything resembling normal human endurance, because stopping meant admitting defeat, and defeat meant more dead. As evening fell on June 6th, a new mission began: collecting the dead. Graves registration units landed in the afternoon waves. Their job was to identify, document, and prepare bodies for burial. It's a job no one volunteers for, but someone has to do. On Omaha Beach, it was overwhelming. Bodies floated in the surf, tangled in obstacles. Bodies lay half buried in sand. Bodies hung from barbed wire on the bluffs. Bodies were scattered across 6 miles of coastline. Private First Class John Barnes was with Graves registration. We'd tag each man, record their name, rank, serial number, take their personal effects to send home. We tried to treat them with dignity, but there were so many, and the tide kept bringing more back. Some bodies couldn't be identified. Tags were lost. Faces destroyed by gunfire. Entire squads killed together with no witnesses to their names. These became the unknown soldiers, men who'd done everything asked of them and would be buried without names. The Graves registration teams worked through the night. By June 7th, they'd identified and moved over 700 bodies to temporary burial sites. Another 300 were still missing, washed out to sea, buried in collapsed bunkers, lost in ways that meant their families would wait months for confirmation of what they already knew in their hearts. This wasn't glory. This wasn't heroism. This was the part of war that doesn't make it into movies. Just exhausted men doing the saddest work imaginable, one body at a time. While the dead were being collected, the wounded were still waiting. Not everyone could be evacuated immediately. The landing craft that brought reinforcements in would take. Wounded out, but there weren't enough boats for everyone. Triage determined the order. 1. Critical but salvageable, evacuate first. 2. Serious but stable, wait. 3. Walking wounded, last priority. 4. Dying, make comfortable. That 4th category was the cruelest. Men who wouldn't survive the boat ride to England were given morphine and moved aside to make room for those who might. Chaplain John Burkhalter spent June 6th evening moving between dying men. They'd ask me if they were going to make it. Most knew the answer. I'd hold their hands, say prayers, lie to them if it brought comfort. What else could I do? Some men died waiting for evacuation that never came. Some survived hours of agony, only to die on the boat ride back. Some made it to field hospitals in England, only to succumb to infections days later. The 1,000 confirmed dead on June 6th became 1,200 by June 8th, then 1,400 by June 15th as wounded. Men lost battles against blood loss, shock, and infection. Every number was a man who'd survived the beach only to die later. Men who'd thought they'd made it. Men whose last conscious thought was probably relief that they'd survived, before they didn't. Among the personal effects collected from the dead were letters. Hundreds of letters. Some were from home. Final letters from mothers, wives, girlfriends that arrived too late. Letters asking soldiers to stay safe, to write back soon, to come home. The soldiers would never read them. Others were letters soldiers had written but never sent. Plans for after the war, promises to loved ones. Words they'd wanted to say but ran out of time for. These letters were gathered, cataloged, and sent to next of kin along with the soldiers' effects. Imagine receiving your son's wedding ring, his wallet, and a letter he'd written to you that starts, "Dear Mom, if you're reading this." Private Felix Branham wrote to his wife on June 5th, "Tomorrow's the big day. I can't tell you where we're going, but I can tell you I love you more than anything. If I don't make it back, please know that every moment with you was worth whatever happens next. Kiss our daughter for me. Tell her daddy loved her." Branham died at 6:40 a.m. 4 minutes after landing. The letter reached his wife 3 weeks later. His daughter was 2 years old. She'd never remember him. There were hundreds of letters like Branham's. Hundreds of last words from men who knew what was coming. Men who wrote goodbye just in case, but who still believed, had to believe, that they'd make it back. They didn't. For the men who survived Omaha Beach, the hardest battle came next, living with survival. Survivor's guilt, the irrational but overwhelming feeling that you should have died too, plagued thousands of D-Day veterans for decades. Why did I live when better men died? What made me special? What did I do to deserve surviving when he didn't? There are no good answers. Sergeant Ray Lambert was wounded 4 times on Omaha Beach, but survived. He spent the rest of his life, 75 more years, haunted by June 6th. I think about the boys who didn't make it every single day. Every single day. I see their faces. I remember their names. Why them and not me? I've never figured it out. Lambert wasn't alone. D-Day veterans reported higher rates of depression, anxiety, and what we now call PTSD than veterans of other battles. The randomness of survival seemed to make it worse. If there'd been a reason, something they'd done to earn survival, it might have been easier to process. But there was no reason. Just luck. And for many survivors, living with that luck felt like a betrayal of the men who died beside them. Some dealt with it by speaking publicly, keeping their friends' memories alive through testimony. Others never spoke of it at all, carrying the weight silently until they died. Neither approach made the guilt go away. It was just part of who they were now. Men who'd survived something they shouldn't have, for reasons they'd never understand. The emotional toll hit officers differently. They carried not just survivor's guilt, but command responsibility. Every dead soldier was someone they'd led, someone whose death they might have prevented with a different order, a different decision, a different plan. Captain Taylor Fellers commanded a company that lost 60% of its men on June 6th. He wrote in his diary that night, "I keep thinking about every decision I made today. Left instead of right. Move now instead of wait. Which orders saved lives? Which ones cost them? I'll never know. But I'll think about it until I die." Some officers broke under the weight. They requested transfers. They stepped down from command. They simply couldn't face leading more men into combat knowing what it cost. Others became harder, more distant, building emotional walls because caring too much about your soldiers made every death unbearable. And some found a middle path, honoring the dead by leading the living better, learning from mistakes, making different choices, trying to ensure that deaths weren't wasted, that the mission succeeded, that the sacrifice meant something. But all of them carried the weight. Every officer who led men on D-Day spent the rest of their lives with a very specific kind of arithmetic. How many men did I land with? How many came home? How many didn't? Could I have saved more? On the evening of June 6th, as soldiers tried to sleep in foxholes and shell craters, they faced a truth that every combat veteran learns. Tomorrow comes whether you're ready or not. There was no time to grieve, no time to process, no time to fall apart. The invasion was 24 hours old, and there were still Germans to fight, ground to take, and a war to win, so they pushed it down. Compartmentalized. Focused on the immediate. Check your weapon. Eat something. Sleep if you can. Don't think about who's missing. Private Harold Baumgarten wrote, "That night, lying in a hole in the ground, I realized I couldn't think about what happened. Not yet. If I started, I'd never stop. So I just didn't. I thought about tomorrow. Only tomorrow." That coping mechanism, focusing on the next mission, the next objective, anything except the trauma, kept soldiers functional during the war. But trauma doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It waits. And for thousands of D-Day survivors, it waited for decades, until retirement, until old age, until there was nothing left to distract them from memories of a beach in Normandy and friends who never left it. The human cost of Omaha Beach can't be captured in numbers. Not really. 1,000 dead becomes 1,400. 2,400 casualties becomes lifelong injuries, amputations, psychological wounds that never heal. But zoom out further and the cost multiplies. 1,400 dead soldiers means roughly 10,000 people directly devastated. Parents, siblings, spouses, children. Towns like Bedford, Virginia that lost entire generations of young men. Families that received telegrams and never fully recovered. Children who grew up without fathers. Wives who became widows at 22, or 25 years old. And then there are the invisible casualties. The survivors who lived with guilt. Nightmares and trauma for 60, 70, 80 years. The marriages strained by PTSD that wouldn't be diagnosed for decades. The soldiers who came home but weren't really home. Part of them stayed on that beach forever. War is always sold as glory and heroism. And yes, there was glory at Omaha Beach. Yes, there was heroism. But there was also a 19-year-old kid from Virginia floating face down in the surf while his mother set an extra plate at dinner because the telegram hadn't arrived yet. There was also a medic making a Choice between which wounded man gets the last morphine while both screamed for help. There was also a lieutenant spending the rest of his life, wondering if he'd ordered his men forward 2 minutes earlier. Would more have survived or would more have died? These are the costs that don't fit in history textbooks. The costs that get summarized as casualties were heavy but acceptable. Acceptable to who? Not to Bedford, Virginia. Not to the medics who still wake up hearing screams. Not to the children who never knew their fathers. Next episode, our final episode, we'll talk about how Omaha Beach is remembered, what it means, why it still matters 80 years later, how we honor the dead, and why their sacrifice demands more from us than just saying thank you for your service, because remembering isn't enough. Understanding the cost, really understanding it, that's what we owe them. If this series has meant something to you, please subscribe. These stories need to be told. These men need to be remembered. Not as statistics, as people dot crosses in Normandy American Cemetery at sunset, thousands of them stretching into the distance. Subscribe button, final episode preview, series playlist every year. Thousands of people visit a cliff overlooking a beach in Normandy, France. They stand where German machine guns once fired. They look down at the sand where American soldiers died. They read names on white crosses stretching in perfect rows as far as the eye can see, and they ask a question that has no simple answer. Why does this still matter? It's been 80 years since D-Day. Everyone who fought there is now gone or in their final years. The world has moved on. New wars, new crises, new generations who can't imagine what June 6, 1944 felt like. So why are we still talking about a beach in France and men who died before most of us were born? Because what happened at Omaha Beach wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about what human beings are capable of when everything depends on them. This is the story of what Omaha Beach means. Not what it meant, what it means. Right now. Today. Let's start with the practical question. What did Omaha Beach accomplish? On June 6, 1944, 5 Allied beaches were assaulted. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Omaha was the Americans' responsibility, and it nearly failed, but nearly doesn't count in war. By nightfall on D-Day, 34,000 Americans were ashore at Omaha. The beachhead was secured. Supplies were flowing. The invasion, Europe's liberation, was underway. Within a week, over 300,000 Allied troops and 50,000 vehicles had landed across all 5 beaches. Within a month, they'd broken out of Normandy and begun the drive toward Germany. Within a year, Hitler was dead, and Nazi Germany had surrendered. None of that happens without Omaha Beach. If the Americans had been pushed back into the sea, if the invasion had failed, the timeline of World War II changes completely. Maybe the Allies try again in 1945. Maybe the Soviet Union conquers all of Europe alone. Maybe the war drags on for years with millions more dead. We don't know what would have happened. But we know what did happen. Omaha Beach held. And because it held, Europe was liberated. Democracy survived. The 20th century took a different path than it would have if D-Day failed. That's what Omaha Beach accomplished strategically. But Omaha Beach's impact wasn't just military. It was psychological. For 5 years, Nazi Germany had dominated Europe. France fell in 6 weeks, Poland in 4. Nazi propaganda declared the Third Reich invincible, the master race unstoppable. Then the Allies landed at Normandy, and within 11 months, Berlin was in ruins. Hitler was dead, and the 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. D-Day was the beginning of that end. It proved the Nazis could be beaten. It proved that Fortress Europe had cracks. It proved that for all of Hitler's grand speeches, when push came to shove, his armies could be defeated by ordinary men willing to risk everything. The psychological impact on occupied Europe was immediate. French resistance activity surged. Underground networks across Europe intensified. People who'd lived under Nazi occupation for years suddenly saw hope. And on the other side, German soldiers began to doubt. If the Allies could take Normandy's beaches, what couldn't they do? Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded German defenses in France, wrote after D-Day, "The invasion has succeeded. The question now is not whether we can hold France, but how quickly we will lose it." He was right. 11 months later, the war in Europe was over. Omaha Beach didn't win World War II alone, but it was the crack in the dam that became a flood. History is full of what-ifs, but D-Days is particularly haunting. What if the destroyers hadn't moved in close to support the troops? What if General Cota hadn't landed and inspired men to move forward? What if just a few more German reinforcements had arrived in time? The margin between victory and disaster at Omaha Beach was razor thin. One historian calculated that if German defenders had been reinforced by just one additional battalion, 1,000 men, the invasion might have been pushed back. If D-Day had failed, the consequences were unthinkable. Allied morale shattered. Stalin potentially making a separate peace with Germany. The Holocaust continuing unchecked for months or years longer. The Cold War map looking completely different. Maybe no unified Western Europe, no NATO, no post-war prosperity. We take the post-1945 world for granted. Western democracy, the European Union, America as a superpower. But that world was built on the foundation of June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach was the hinge, the moment, the choice between two different futures. And for 12 hours, the outcome was in doubt. The fact that we live in the world we do, that Western democracy survived, that Europe was liberated, that Nazi Germany was defeated utterly, is owed in part to men who died in the surf on a beach in Normandy. That's what Omaha Beach meant for history. Just above Omaha Beach, on a bluff overlooking the ocean, sits the Normandy American Cemetery, painted white marble crosses and Stars of David arranged in perfect rows across a 172 acres. Each marker represents an American serviceman killed during the Normandy campaign. 157 of them are marked unknown, soldiers whose names were lost to war but whose service was not. If you visit, and millions have, the scale is overwhelming. Row after row after row of white stone stretching toward the horizon. Each name representing a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future erased. The cemetery is immaculate. The grass perfectly maintained. Flowers placed regularly. American flags flying alongside French. Why? Because France hasn't forgotten. French President Jacques Chirac once said, "No French citizen will ever forget that the soil of France was liberated by the blood of Americans." Every June 6th, French schoolchildren place flowers on graves. Elderly French citizens who remember the occupation visit to say thank you to men they never met. Towns across Normandy hold ceremonies, fly American flags, and teach their children what D-Day meant. Because for France, for all of occupied Europe, D-Day wasn't just a military operation. It was liberation. It was the day hope returned. For decades, most D-Day veterans didn't talk about their experiences. The memories were too raw, the trauma too deep, the guilt too heavy. But as they aged, as they realized the story would die with them, many began to speak. Ray Lambert, wounded 4 times on Omaha Beach, didn't tell his full story until he was in his 90s. For 70 years, I couldn't talk about it. Every time I tried, I'd see their faces, the boys who didn't make it. But then I realized, if I don't tell their stories, who will? They can't speak for themselves anymore, so I have to. Lambert traveled to Normandy repeatedly, speaking to students, giving interviews, ensuring that the sacrifice of June 6th wasn't reduced to textbook footnotes. He died in 2020 at age 100. Before he passed, he was asked what he wanted people to remember about D-Day. His answer, remember the boys who stayed on that beach. Remember their names. Remember they had families, dreams, futures. They weren't statistics. They were people. And they died so we could live free. That's the power of survivor testimony. They humanize history. They transform numbers into people. They remind us that 1,000 dead isn't an acceptable casualty rate. It's 1,000 individual tragedies. But time is running out. The youngest D-Day veterans are now over 95 years old. Within a few years, there will be no one left who can say, "I was there," which means it's our responsibility now. We have to become the memory keepers. So why does a battle from 1944 still matter in 2024? In 2044? In 2144? Because the lessons of Omaha Beach are timeless. Lesson 1. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action despite fear. Every man on that beach was terrified. They went forward anyway. Lesson 2, leadership matters. General Cota standing upright in machine gun fire changed the course of history. One person doing the right thing at the right moment can inspire thousands. Lesson 3, freedom isn't free. We use that phrase so often it's become a cliché, but on June 6, 1944, it was literally true. Democracy's survival was paid for in blood on that beach. Lesson 4, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The men who took Omaha Beach weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, mechanics, teachers, sons. They were us. And when civilization needed them, they rose to the occasion. These lessons don't expire. They're as relevant now as they were 80 years ago. When we face our own challenges, personal, national, global, we can look back at Omaha Beach and remember, human beings have overcome worse. With courage, sacrifice, and determination, seemingly impossible obstacles can be defeated. That's why it still matters. Not because we should glorify war, we shouldn't, but because we should never forget what our freedom cost. And we should never take for granted the world those men died to give us. What do we owe the men who died at Omaha Beach? We owe them remembrance, certainly. But what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean militarism. It doesn't mean glorifying war or claiming every conflict is worth the cost. The men who fought at D-Day saw war's horrors up close. Most would tell you that war should always be the last resort. But it does mean understanding that the freedom we enjoy, the ability to speak freely, to vote, to live without tyranny, was purchased by people who gave literally everything. It means teaching the next generation not just that D-Day happened, but what it cost and why it mattered. It means visiting memorials, reading their stories, saying their names out loud so they're not forgotten. It means living lives worthy of their sacrifice, building the kind of world they thought they were fighting for. Just, free, democratic, peaceful. Veterans advocate Tom Hanks, who produced multiple D-Day documentaries, put it this way: we owe them a debt we can never repay, but we can honor it by remembering, by learning, by being citizens worthy of what they gave us. That's the obligation. Not guilt, gratitude. Not performative patriotism, genuine understanding, and most importantly, ensuring that in 50 years, in 100 years, someone is still telling the story of a beach in Normandy and the men who died there. Time is running out to hear D-Day stories from the men who lived them. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, thousands of veterans returned to Normandy. They were in their 70s, old but still vital, able to walk the beaches and tell their stories firsthand. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary, hundreds returned. Many needed wheelchairs. Some needed oxygen. But they came. In 2014, on the 70th anniversary, dozens made the trip. Most were over 90. It would be the last time many saw Normandy. In 2024, on the 80th anniversary, only a handful of D-Day veterans were still alive. Those who could travel did. One last trip, one last ceremony, one last chance to honor fallen friends. By 2030, there will likely be no D-Day veterans left. The living link to that day will be broken, which means everything changes. No more first-hand accounts. No more interviews. No more frail old men telling young people, let me tell you what it was really like. Just historians, documentaries, books, and memorials. Is that enough? Can we keep the memory alive without the witnesses? We have to. Because forgetting isn't neutral. It's a betrayal. Every soldier who died on Omaha Beach died believing that what they were fighting for mattered. That future generations would remember. That their sacrifice had meaning. We honor them by ensuring that belief was correct. So what can you do? What can any of us do to honor Omaha Beach's legacy? First, learn. Don't let this be the last documentary about D-Day you watch. Read books, visit museums. If you can, visit Normandy. Walk that beach, stand in front of those graves, feel the weight of what happened there. Second, teach. If you have kids, tell them about D-Day. If you're a teacher, Make sure your students understand not just the battle, but the cost. If you're just someone who cares, share these stories, post about them, keep them alive in conversation. Third, support veterans, not just World War II. Veterans, though we should honor them while we can, but all veterans. The willingness to serve, to risk everything for something bigger than yourself, deserves our respect and support. Fourth, be a citizen. Vote. Participate in democracy. Hold leaders accountable. Build the kind of society those men thought they were fighting for. Don't waste the freedom they died to preserve. And finally, remember their names. Not just the famous ones, Eisenhower, Bradley, Cota, but the ordinary ones. Private Robert Sales, killed at 6:35 a.m., age 19. Technician John Pinder died after being wounded 3 times, age 32. Lieutenant Timothy O'Neill, last seen leading men up the bluffs, age 23. Medic Thomas Wade treated 40 men before bleeding to death, age 21. Say their names. Remember they were real. Remember they had families, dreams, futures. Remember that 9,288 crosses in France represent 9,288 reasons we can't forget. Because if we forget them, they die twice. Once on the beach, once in our memory. We can't let that happen. This is the final episode of our D-Day series. We've walked through the planning, the preparation, the assault, the heroes, the turning point, and the cost. We've tried to tell the story not just as history, but as human experience. Not just what happened, but what it felt like, what it cost, what it meant. Because D-Day isn't ancient history. It's living memory. It shaped the world we inhabit today. The freedom we take for granted was paid for on beaches in Normandy. 80 years later, the waves still wash over Omaha Beach. The sun still rises over those cliffs. The cemetery still stands, perfectly maintained, waiting for visitors who want to understand. And in 1,000 small towns across America, elderly men, the last survivors, still wake up some mornings and think about friends who never came home. Who never got to marry, have children, grow old, see grandchildren, who stayed 19, 20, 25 forever. Those men are why we remember. Not the generals, not the politicians. The 19-year-old kids from Virginia and Texas and California who got on boats knowing they might die and went anyway. President Ronald Reagan spoke at Normandy on the 40th anniversary of D-Day. He addressed the surviving veterans. You were young the day you took these cliffs. Some of you were hardly more than boys, with the deepest joys of life before you. Yet, you risked everything here. Why? Why did you do it? What impelled you to put aside the instinct for self-preservation and risk your lives to take these cliffs? What inspired all the men of the armies that met here? And he answered his own question. It was faith and belief. It was loyalty and love. Faith that freedom mattered. Belief that tyranny must be opposed. Loyalty to comrades and country. Love for families and the future. That's what drove them onto Omaha Beach. That's what kept them moving forward when everything said to stop. That's what we remember. Not because war is glorious. It isn't. But because sacrifice is sacred. And courage in the face of overwhelming odds is the best of what humans can be. 80 years later, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And the least we can do, the very least, is remember their names and tell their stories. So that 100 years from now, someone will still know what happened at Omaha Beach. Someone will still care. Someone will still say, thank you. We haven't forgotten. We never will. Thank you for watching this series. If it meant something to you, please share it. These stories need to be told. These men need to be remembered, not for our sake, for theirs. the Normandy American Cemetery at sunrise. Camera slowly pulling back to show the full scope of 9,388 graves, then fading to an American flag waving gently in the breeze. Subscribe button, series playlist, pinned comment asking viewers to share their own family's D-Day connections. Do you have a family connection to D-Day? Share your grandfather's, great-uncle's, or relative's story in the comments. Let's honor them together. Entire series playlist, subscribe button, related D-Day content.